We are going to be replacing the driver's side strut on a 2001 Dodge Caravan Sport. We're using the Monroe Quick-Strut, which includes the strut and spring already compressed. It makes this job much easier for a DIY. What I've got here are all the tools that we're going to need to perform this replacement. This is optional but helpful in getting the wheel off, as well as the pinch bolts that hold the strut to the steering knuckle. It's an impact wrench. We've got a sledgehammer to knock loose those pinch bolts. We've got our 3/4 inch socket to remove the lug nuts. Technically those are a metric, so you could use an 18mm socket. We do have an 18mm socket here, as well as an 18mm wrench, and this is to remove the sway bar link that ties into the strut, into this hole, which we'll see when we actually take it off. We've got a torque wrench, so we can make sure we get the proper torque when we tighten everything back down. And then we have two 21mm sockets that we're going to use to actually remove the pinch bolts. We've got a 13mm socket, which we will use to remove the upper strut mounting bolts. Safety glasses. We've got some anti-seize compound that we're going to use on some of these bolts. Some penetrating spray, this happens to be Croyle, and some heat to make removing the pinch bolts easier. We also have, should we need to use the heat, a couple of wet rags to protect our CV boots and our brake lines so that we don't melt those. Okay, so the first step, after you've jacked up the vehicle, as you can see we've jacked it up, got the wheel off the ground, is to remove our wheel. And now we can see all the components that we're going to have to remove in order to get this strut out. These are the two pinch bolts that we mentioned. These are 21mm. You'll need a socket on, really just need a socket for this end, taking them off, because these are splined in there, so this end will not turn. We've got the sway bar link. This is where you're going to use your 18mm socket and wrench to remove just the upper mounting bolt. We've got our ABS sensor that mounts on a little bracket. This is a 10mm nut that you'll use to remove. And then we have our three upper mounting bolts that we're going to loosen and remove to pull the strut out. With our 13mm wrench, we will go ahead and loosen up these upper mounting bolts. And we're not going to take these completely off right now, we're just going to loosen them. You can see I'm using a ratcheting box and wrench here. It just makes the process a little bit easier since you don't have a lot of room to work on these minivans. So we just want to get those loose right now. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and remove the sway bar link. And this is an aftermarket sway bar link. This one happens to have an 18mm nut on the inside to prevent the actual bolt from spinning when we loosen it. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on the back side to hold it in place. And then I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to use an impact wrench. And you can see for about a week now I've actually been spraying this every other day with penetrating oil, just to make it a little bit easier to remove. So we're going to loosen that up right now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish this up by hand. So I've got 18mm socket here, and I've still got my wrench on the back to keep that from turning. So we've got that off. Take the wrench off. And sometimes you need to apply a little bit of downward pressure on the sway bar in order to loosen this and get it out. You just want to move that out of the way. Next thing we're going to do, we can either take this off right now or just slide these out of this little bracket off. I'm just going to go ahead and take this out right now. And this is one of the bolts when putting it back in that we'll want to use a little bit of anti-seize compound on. And this is just a 10mm socket we're using to get this out. You can see once this is out, this just slides off. Now, our next two bolts, which could be the most difficult, are the two pinch bolts. And these are 21mm sockets, or 21mm bolt. So you'll want a 21mm socket for your impact wrench. Now if you don't have an impact socket, you can use a regular socket. Just know there's a potential that it could break. What I'm using right now is a 3/8 inch 21mm socket with a 1/2 inch to 3/8 inch impact reducer. And I have not applied any heat to these yet. We're going to go ahead and try them first without heat. When I did the other side, I did have to apply heat to this top pinch bolt to get it out, but we'll give it a shot and see what we get. And actually, this one came loose pretty easily. So we'll go ahead and try the bottom now. And that came loose pretty easily as well. Now, what I just did, I didn't want to do. I don't want to actually take these all the way off yet. Because what I want to do, we're going to have to pound these out. I want to use the nut and my socket in order to pound those out and avoid damaging the head of the bolt. So now I'm going to get my sledgehammer. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my socket right up on this nut. You can see there's a flange on this nut to stop it from going over. And rather than beating on the end of the nut and risk damaging those threads, we're just going to hit the actual socket. And all we're trying to do is break that loose to knock it out. And now you can see we've actually got play in there and it's loose. So we're going to do the same thing up here. See, this one's not coming quite as easily, and then I ran into this on the other one, and I did end up having to use some heat to get that hot, and then it popped loose real easily. This one, though, finally came loose. Okay, now that we've got these loose, one thing that we want to do before we pull this out, you notice we've got our CV boot down here. We want to make sure that we protect that, so when this drops down, we don't accidentally tear it, because that ends up being a big mess. And then you potentially have to replace this whole half axle in here, which we don't want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover this with this rag folded over. And what that should do is prevent any sharp edges when this drops down from cutting that. We're going to try not to let that rest on it anyway. But I'm going to go ahead and pull these off now. And now that we've broken that loose from that spline, we do have to hold this on this side if we're going to turn it, because it is going to want to turn. So we've got that loose. We're going to go ahead and pull this one out.